9,000 years, 2 votes against. Neither vote mattered. Admiral Vexrath stood on the platform at the center of the classification chamber, where the walls held pale blue light and the air smelled of ozone and machines. Around him, on tiered stone seats, the Dominion's judges waited for the tally. The screen behind him lit up. Earth. Cantasori 7. Diath World. 432 votes for sterilization. 3 against. One of the 3, an old Morvani named Morvath, said nothing. He had watched 9 worlds get this same verdict. 9 times the room had cheered. This time it didn't feel different to anyone but him. The footnote scrolled under the verdict, small enough that most judges never read it. Recommend sterilization at standard orbital distance. No ground contact. No ground contact. Vexrath had signed 100 of these. He had never once needed to ask why that line was there. Somewhere in the chamber, a junior officer whispered a question that never got answered. Vexrath didn't hear it. He was already thinking about supply routes. You'll want to hear how this war ends. I promise you, it isn't the way anyone in that chamber expected. 300 light-years away, a woman was drinking tea. Admiral Alara Kalin held the cup with both hands, the way her grandmother used to, and read the same page twice. The bridge of Earth Defense Command smelled like old coffee and recycled air. Scrinces glowed low. Nobody spoke above a murmur. She set the cup down without finishing it. Wake the reclamation protocol, she said. Commander Marcus Webb looked up from his console. He was 41, a worn photograph of his daughter tucked in his jacket pocket, and he had never once heard those words said out loud. Ma'am, that's a 47-year-old file. We've never activated it. Kalen's face didn't move. It's never been needed, she said. Until now, Webb pulled the file. It was old in the way old things get old on purpose, updated quietly every few years, by officers who never met each other, who never asked why, who just signed and filed and forgot. 47 pages of legal language and one long list of numbers nobody outside a lab had ever cared about. Lieutenant Jenna Torres turned from the comm station. Her mother had served on the diplomatic mission that first tracked the Varak decades back. They're inbound, Torres said. Confirmed. Full pacification fleet. Kalin nodded like she'd been expecting the words for years. She had. Doctor? Amara Singh's voice came through on a secure line from a converted grain silo in Nebraska, the closest thing Earth had to a war room for microbes. Admiral, if they're coming, they need to know what they're walking into. I've had this ready a long time. Send it, Kalin said. The report was short. 43 extremophile species, bacteria that ate through calcium-based scale, viruses built for a different kind of lung. Earth's bacteria didn't care what species asked permission to breathe. Singh had known for 34 years the Varak avoided water. Not disliked it, avoided it the way something avoids fire. Nobody in the Dominion had ever asked why. Webb read the old file line by line, and something in his voice changed. This isn't a defense plan, he said slowly. This is a targeting list. It's both, Kalin said. It always was. Outside the chamber's viewport, the fleet appeared first as a smear of light, then as a shape, then as a wall of hulls sliding into high orbit. 1,200 ships, 400,000 soldiers. 67 supply vessels that would never be needed for a campaign that's short. Vexrath's voice went out on every channel Earth's satellites could catch. You have been classified as a Category 7 death world. You will be sterilized. Resistance is meaningless. You have 5 of your minutes. On the bridge, nobody answered him yet. Kalin looked at the old file one more time, then closed it. Deploy the packages, she said. All 47 12 orbital platforms released what looked, from a distance, like debris. Nobody down in the Dominion fleet flagged it. Debris didn't fire. Debris didn't fight back. Webb watched the packages drift, tumbling slow and harmless toward the platforms that housed the Varak's own sterilization array. They'll think it's junk, he said. They will, Kalin agreed. Right up until it isn't. Far above the planet, Elder Morvith activated his recorder the way he had 9 times before. This was his 10th death world. He had never once heard one answer back. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to. The first ships broke atmosphere at 14:31 Earth time. Vexrath watched the descent feeds from his flagship, arms crossed in the correct number for confidence, 2 folded, 2 loose at his sides. Ground teams touched down in 8 zones, the plains of North America, the river deltas of Europe, the flooded paddies of Southeast Asia, a scatter of Pacific islands. Standard doctrine. Spread wide, minimize resistance clustering, let the sterilization teams work in from the edges. He did not send troops near open water. Some old instinct in Varak doctrine said don't, the way a species remembers a fear it has forgotten the reason for. Nobody in 9,000 years had asked why the doctrine existed. It just did, Dr. Singh had asked. 34 years of asking. On the bridge, Torres kept her eyes on the tactical display, watching green dots spread across a world map. They're avoiding the coasts, she said. Every landing zone is at least 40 kilometers inland. They always do, Kalen said. Doesn't matter. Our air isn't inland only. Webb had the old file open beside him now, 47 pages glowing on his console, and for the first time he understood what no ground contact in the Varak footnote actually meant. Someone on their side had written that line a long time ago after watching something they refused to name. At 1437, the first Varak soldier stepped out of a landing craft in what used to be Kansas and breathed. Nothing happened, not yet. By 1444, soldiers across all 8 zones had been on the ground for 7 minutes. Officers began filing routine reports. No resistance encountered, proceeding to sterilization staging. Vexrath allowed himself something close to satisfaction. 14 campaigns. Never a delay past the first hour. At 1452, the first soldier collapsed in the Kansas field and did not get back up. His squad mate knelt beside him, checked vitals through the suit display, and found numbers that made no sense. Something in the air. Something in the ground. His own vitals started sliding the same direction 30 seconds later. By 1458, 3 of the 8 zones were reporting the same thing. Soldiers down, no visible cause, medical scanners returning readings nobody had trained for. Vexrath's aide brought him the first casualty count in person, not over comm. The way bad news travels differently than good. Sir, 37% of ground forces in zones 1, 4, and 6 are non-responsive. Define non-responsive. Dead, sir. Or dying. Vexrath did not move for a long moment. 14 campaigns. Never once had a Deathworld's air killed a soldier standing still. He ordered zones 2, 3, 5, 7, and 8 to pull back to their landers immediately. Half of them made it. On the bridge, Kalen watched the same numbers climb from the other direction, and did not smile. There was nothing in this to smile about. She had just watched thousands of soldiers die in the space of 20 minutes, and the only thing that made it bearable was the file open on Webb's screen. 47 years old, that had predicted almost exactly this. Ma'am, Torres said quietly. My mother wrote part of the original expansion vector report 27 years ago. She flagged the water avoidance behavior in her very first contact log. Nobody above her rank ever followed up. Kalen looked at her. Somebody did, she said. Just not the somebody who gets remembered for it. Elder Morvath's recorder ran continuously now, capturing casualty counts as they streamed in on the Dominion's open tactical channel. He had recorded 9 Deathworld classifications before this one. 9 silences. Populations that never answered back, that simply stopped existing under sterilization fire. This one was different. This one was killing the fleet that came to kill it. He said nothing to the judges still watching from the chamber. He simply kept the recorder running and felt something shift in him that he did not have a word for yet, in any of the languages he had studied across 3,000 years of watching. Vexrath ordered the orbital sterilization array to prepare full-spectrum bombardment. Standard doctrine, when ground pacification failed. Burn the surface clean, salt the fields, let nothing survive that could be called resistance. The order came back within 90 seconds, array offline, all 12 platforms unresponsive. How? Vexrath said. Fouled, sir. The targeting apertures. Something's grown across the intake vents. Engineering doesn't have a classification for it. 12 hours earlier, before the fleet had even finished its final approach, human orbital platforms had released what looked like drifting debris. Nobody in the Dominion fleet had flagged it as a threat, because debris didn't fire, didn't fight, didn't grow. It grew anyway, slow, patient, exactly as long as it needed. Vexrath stared at the readout showing his sterilization array choked with a living film he did not have a name for, and for the first time in 267 years, he did not know what order to give next. Somewhere below him, on a planet he had called a death world, the water kept doing what it had always done. Somebody was shouting on the comm channel now, which had never happened in Vexrath's 14 campaigns. It was the fleet's chief engineer, and he was not shouting orders. He was shouting a question. "Sir, what is this? What did they build? This isn't a weapon. There's no weapon signature. There's nothing to target." Vexwrath had no answer for him. He stood on the platform of his flagship and watched status boards that had never, in 267 years, shown this pattern of red. Below him, Earth kept doing what it always did. Kalen stood at the center of the bridge, arms folded, watching the same feeds from the other side. Nobody cheered. Nobody raised a voice. The silence on the human side was the same silence that had unsettled Morvath for 3,000 years, the silence of something that had already made its decision and didn't need to announce it twice. Webb finally reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph he'd carried through every shift since his daughter was born, the same year the Reclamation Protocol was first drafted. He looked at it for a moment, then set it face down on his console the way he always did before a hard call. It was a small thing. Nobody in the room noticed him do it. "Ma'am," Torres said, "they're retreating landers, the ones that made it back to orbit. They think the survivors might be carrying whatever's killing the ground teams. Somewhere in that fleet, soldiers who had made it back alive were being left outside their own ships, drifting in armor that was slowly failing. They're not being allowed to dock." Kalen frowned. "Explain." "I think their own fleet is refusing contact, contamination protocol, because the Empire that sent them didn't have a category for what had happened to them." Vexwrath heard the same report and said nothing for a long time. His aide, a younger officer named Threll, who had served under him for 2 campaigns, finally spoke without being asked. "Sir, Elder Morvath is requesting to address the fleet." "Denied. He says it's a formal observer's right. Under Dominion Charter." Vexwrath's 4 hands went still at his sides. In 267 years, he had never once needed to invoke that charter against an observer, because no observer had ever had anything worth interrupting him for. "Let him speak," Vexwrath said. Morvath's voice came through on the fleet-wide channel, calm in a way that made the panic around him feel louder by contrast. "This is the 10th death world I have witnessed classified for sterilization. The other 9 never spoke. They burned, and they were silent, and I recorded the silence because that was my function." He paused. "This one is not silent. This one has been speaking since before we arrived. We simply never learned the language. Nobody answered him." Down on the surface, in what had been the Kansas landing zone, one of the fallen soldier's suit cameras kept recording after its wearer stopped moving. It caught nothing dramatic. Just grass, moving slightly in a wind that carried air the soldier's lungs had never been built to survive. Dr. Singh watched that same feed from her silo in Nebraska, on a line patched through by Torres, and did not look away from it. She had spent 34 years studying a fear the Vera carried and never explained. Now she was watching it prove itself correct in real time, and there was no satisfaction in it at all, just a long tiredness and the quiet certainty that she'd been right to keep asking. "They're pulling the whole fleet back," Torres reported. "All 8 ground zones, full retreat to orbital hold." Kalen nodded slowly. She reached for her tea, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. It was a small, ordinary thing to do in the middle of a war ending. Webb noticed this time. He didn't say anything about it either. Vexwrath received the full tally from his tactical officer in person, because by now every officer on the flagship understood that numbers this bad did not belong on an open channel. The soldiers who had gone down. The soldiers who never came back up. The landers that made it to orbit and the ones that didn't. It was the kind of report that took a career and folded it in half. Vexwrath read it twice, the way Kalen had read the Dominion's own verdict twice, hours ago and a lifetime away. "There is no ground contact," Vexwrath said quietly, to no one. "It was never a suggestion, it was a warning. Somebody wrote it into our doctrine generations ago, and none of us ever asked who or why." Thrill said nothing. There was nothing correct to say. Vexwrath looked out at the planet below, blue water, white cloud, a thin green line of coastline. His soldiers had been ordered to avoid on instinct their whole species had never explained to itself. For the first time since he had taken command, he understood that his unbroken record had never been a record of strength. It had been a record of never meeting anything that fought back on its own terms. He opened a channel, alone, unwitnessed by his own bridge crew. Not a formal transmission. Something closer to a private log, the kind an officer keeps when he suspects it might be the last one that matters. 9,000 years, he said. And we never once asked the planet what it thought of us. He did not send it. He simply let it sit in the log, unfinished, the way a man leaves a sentence hanging when he already knows how it ends and doesn't want to say it out loud. On Earth's side, Kaylin finally broke the long quiet on the bridge. "Open every channel they're using," she said. "I want them to hear this directly. No relay, no filter." Torres's hands moved fast across her console. "Channels open, ma'am? All of it. Their whole fleet will hear you." Kaylin didn't reach for notes. She had known what she would say for longer than anyone on that bridge had been alive. "You called it a death world," she said. "We called it home." The words went out across the dark between two fleets, plain and unhurried, landing on a bridge where a commander with 2 centuries of victories behind him had nothing left to answer with. "You made the mistake of thinking we were the weak ones," Kaylin said, "when it was your biology that was fragile." The transmission ended there. She did not add anything else. She did not need to. Vexwrath heard every word of it, standing exactly where he'd been standing since the first casualty report came in, and for the first time in 267 years he had absolutely no idea what to say back. Vexwrath stood there long enough that Threll finally stepped forward, the way an aide does when silence has gone on past the point protocol allows. "Sir? Orders." Vexwrath looked at the planet again. Blue water, white cloud. A coastline his species had avoided on instinct for 9,000 years without ever once asking why. "Full withdrawal," he said. "All ships, all zones." Threll hesitated. "Sir, the charter requires a tribunal ratification before any classification is reversed mid-campaign. If you order withdrawal without it, then I'll answer for it when we're home." Vexwrath turned from the viewport. "I'm not spending what's left of this fleet proving a record that was never worth what I thought it was. The water was never the enemy. The air was never the enemy. We simply never asked which side either one was on. He gave the order himself, on the open channel. So there would be no ambiguity and no junior officer left holding a decision that belonged only to him." Ships peeled away from all 8 ground zones in slow, deliberate order, not a rout, not a collapse, but a retreat conducted by a commander who still even now refused to let his fleet die badly on the way out. Soldiers who had been left drifting outside their own hulls for the better part of an hour were brought in, some of them already past saving, some of them simply shaking. Landers that had made it back from the surface were finally allowed to dock, quarantine protocols stripped away by direct command override. Staring at gloved hands that had touched a world they'd been told for their whole lives could not possibly fight back. One of them, a young soldier named Threll's own cousin, though Threll didn't say so, not on an open channel, not while men were dying, asked the medical officer a question that got repeated up the chain within the hour. What was it? What did they use against us? The medical officer had no good answer. Nothing, she said. As far as we can tell, nothing they built, nothing they fired. It was already here. That answer traveled faster than any weapons report ever had. By the time Vexwrath's flagship reached the outer edge of the system, half his surviving officers had heard some version of it, and none of them liked what it implied about every world their doctrine had ever called safe to walk on. On Earth's bridge, Torres watched the retreat with her hand pressed flat against the edge of her console, the kind of stillness a person holds when they don't quite trust the good news yet. "They're leaving," she said. "All of them. Confirmed retreat vector, full fleet." Kaylin didn't celebrate. She picked her cup back up, found it had gone fully cold now, the tea long past drinkable, and didn't set it down. "Ma'am," Webb said quietly, "casualty reports in from our side." Kaylin already knew. The way she'd known for years this day was possible, that the cost on Earth's side would be a fraction of what it could have been. Full tally. He didn't read it aloud, he didn't need to, and that the difference between those two numbers was the entire reason a 47-year-old file existed in the first place. She looked at him instead of the report. "How many of ours, Marcus?" "Almost none. A handful of technical injuries from the platform deployments. Nobody in the ground zones. There weren't any ground zones on our side to have." He paused. "It worked exactly the way it was designed to. That's the part I can't get used to." Preparation nobody ever had to explain out loud. Webb reached into his jacket and turned the photograph back over, his daughter 4 years old in the picture. "It worked. It was supposed to," Kaylin said. "That's what 47 years of quiet updates buys you, not luck." Born the same year the reclamation protocol was first filed by officers who never met each other and never asked why they'd been told to keep it current. He hadn't set it face down because he doubted the outcome. He'd set it down earlier because for a stretch of minutes he couldn't look at her face and the casualty numbers at the same time. Now he could look at both. "She's going to ask me someday what I did in this war," he said. Not really to Kaylin, more to the photograph itself. "I don't know what I'll tell her. I read an old file, doesn't sound like much." "Tell her the truth," Kaylin said. "You read it carefully?" That's rarer than anyone admits. Down in the converted grain silo in Nebraska, Dr. Singh finally let herself sit down. She'd been on her feet since the first casualty spike in Kansas, watching numbers she'd predicted 34 years ago prove themselves true in real time, and there had been no satisfaction in any of it, only a long, worn kind of relief. Her assistant, a graduate student who joined the project only 2 years earlier and had spent most of that time filing samples, nobody explained the purpose of, finally asked the question everyone in the silo had been too tired to ask. "Did you know it would work?" "Really, no." Singh thought about that for a moment. "I knew the biology," she said. "I didn't know if anyone would ever believe the biology mattered more than the ships. Most of my career believing that made me look like someone counting bacteria while everyone else counted warheads." She looked at the monitor at the retreating dots on the tactical feed. Turns out the bacteria were the warheads. Nobody just wanted to say it that way out loud, because it sounds absurd until the day it isn't. Above the retreating fleet, Elder Morveth kept his recorder running, the way he had through 9 Deathworld classifications before this one. For the first time in 3,000 years of watching, he did not feel like an observer standing outside the thing he recorded. He felt spoken to directly, and it changed the shape of what he needed to say next. He addressed the fleet-wide channel first, his voice carrying none of the formal distance he'd carried the first 9 times he'd done this. "I have witnessed 9 Deathworld classifications," he said. 9 silences. Populations that burned and never answered, because they were never given the chance to answer. This is the first time I have watched a world respond to its own sentence. He paused, letting the words sit in the static. "I recommend, for whatever the Dominion still wishes my recommendation to be worth, that the classification be withdrawn, not softened. Withdrawn, and that no fleet return here again under any doctrine for any reason." Another pause, longer. "We called this a death world because it kills what threatens it. That is not a flaw in a world. That is what a home does." Nobody on the retreating fleet answered him. But 3 days later, when the fleet reached the edge of Dominion-controlled space and Morvath's recording finally reached the tribunal chamber where the vote had first been cast, the silence there was different. 432 judges who had voted for sterilization sat through the full recording without a single interruption. When it ended, nobody moved to speak first. An older judge, one of the original 3 dissenters, finally rose. "The reclamation protocol," she said, using the human term because the Dominion had no word of its own for a plan built entirely around patience. How long had it existed before today? 47 years, Morvath said, his voice carried into the chamber by relay. Updated quietly, every few years, by officers who never met one another and were never told why the update mattered. A species that can sustain a single unspoken decision across 2 generations of its own officers is not a death world. It is something else. I do not have a word for what, in any language I have studied. The vote to formally rescind Earth's classification passed on the first count. 430 of the original 432 present that day changed their position. He was still 3 days from home, standing on the platform of a flagship that had lost more soldiers in one afternoon than in his previous 14 campaigns combined. The 2 who did not were removed from the chamber before the session closed, though the official record listed no reason. Vexrath was not present for that vote, composing the private log entry he had left unsent since the moment his sterilization array first reported itself fouled. This time he let it finish and he let it send. 9,000 years, it read. And we never once asked the planet what it thought of us. It told us anyway. We simply weren't listening in a language we understood. He stopped there, then added one more line alone, unwitnessed by anyone on his own bridge. I do not know if I will be permitted to command again. I find, examining that thought honestly for the first time in 2 centuries, that I'm not certain I want to. Thrill found him there afterward and said nothing about the log, though the transmission stamp made it clear he'd have seen it cross the relay. He simply stood beside his commander for a while, the 2 of them watching the same blue-white world shrink behind the ship's wake, and eventually said the only thing that felt like it belonged in that silence. "For what it's worth, sir, I don't think anyone could have known. Not from anything we'd ever seen before. That's exactly the problem, Vexwrath said. We built a doctrine out of everything we'd seen before, and never once built room in it for the thing we hadn't. He didn't look away from the viewport. Ilder Morvath said something true up there. Before all of this started, I heard it and thought nothing of it. He said this was the 10th death world he'd witnessed, and the first that ever spoke. I have spent 267 years assuming silence meant weakness. It only ever meant I hadn't asked the right question. Back on Earth, evening settled over the bridge the way it always did, indifferent to what the day had cost or spared. There was nothing in what had happened that felt like winning, only like a very old, very patient thing had finally been allowed to do the job it was quietly built for. 34 years and 47 years and 2 centuries of accumulated waiting all arriving, unannounced. Kaelin walked the length of the room once, slow, the way she did at the close of every long shift, and stopped at the viewport where the last smear of retreating Dominion light was fading past the edge of the system. She didn't say anything about winning. At the same afternoon, Webb closed the old file for what he understood would be the last time anyone needed to open it as an active order. He didn't delete it. Some records you keep, not because you'll need them again, but because forgetting why you built something is how you end up needing it again. He set the photograph of his daughter upright on the console, where it stayed, instead of going back in his pocket, facing outward now, toward the room, the way a thing does once it's stopped needing to be hidden from anything. Kaelin picked her cup back up one last time. Still cold, she drank it anyway, the way her grandmother always had, and set the empty cup down on the console beside the closed file. Outside, Earth kept turning indifferent and exact, the same water and the same air doing the same quiet work it had done for 4.5 billion years, long before anyone alive had needed a name for what it was protecting.